First of all, Vincent van Gogh. That's my attempt at pronouncing it in Dutch, just so that people know that I vaguely know how it's supposed to be pronounced, although I probably have an English accent even so. But throughout this video I'll just be saying Van Gogh, just because I think, on balance, I find it, I feel pretentious when I just drop in foreign names, and I find it difficult to do. And, well, last time I did a video on this, I got criticised for not pronouncing it properly every time, and I also got criticised for being pretentious on the occasions when I did pronounce it properly. So I'm just going to go with the... I'm going to lean on the fact that Van Gogh certainly was used to people pronouncing it wrong, because he lived in England and France over the course of his life, and so I don't feel bad about pronouncing it in an English way here. So in general, this video is going to be about the extent to which it's sensible or even possible to give somebody a medical diagnosis or refine a medical diagnosis of somebody who isn't alive anymore. This umbrella's going to be really annoying. Hopefully that does the trick. Yeah, so this video is going to be about the extent to which it's sensible or possible to perform a kind of medical diagnosis on a historical figure who's dead. And the reason Van Gogh, well, first of all, I'm not a medical professional at all, I'm not a doctor, I'm not qualified to give anyone a diagnosis nowadays, let alone in the past, retroactively, so this is going to lean very heavily on the literature that's already been written on this by people more qualified than me. The only thing I have even approaching a qualification to talk about this is I've just come to the end of, but not yet been graded on, a cognitive neuroscience master's where we did look at neuropathology, so at least I feel like I'm able to read some of the literature on this and understand the terminology a bit better than I would have been, say, a couple of years ago. But that absolutely doesn't qualify me to make a medical diagnosis, so yeah, I'll be leaning heavily on literature that already exists. The reason Van Gogh is such a good candidate for this kind of thing is because he lived recently enough that the modern European medical system is pretty much contiguous with the one that existed in the late 1800s. Obviously it's not the same medical system, and there have been a lot of changes and advances and things, but it's recognisably the descendant of the same system. It's also good because Van Gogh was very forthcoming about his symptoms and things in letters that he wrote to his brother and other people in his life. He was pretty open about things like alcohol dependence and how his alcohol use went up and down, about sexual problems he'd been having. So it seems as though he is happy talking about the kinds of things that somebody might be a bit reticent to talk about. Although that doesn't guarantee he said everything, but it's a good indicator that maybe he talked about in his letters all of the things he considered relevant to his health. And there are also medical records that were not written by him. So he's a good candidate to do a video like this about. So for anyone who doesn't know, Van Gogh was a Dutch artist that was born in 1853. Over the course of his life he did various things. He was an art dealer when he was younger. He lived in places like England and France. Towards the end of his life he lived in France. And from the mid-late 1880s, when he was in his mid to late 30s, he began to experience more alarming medical symptoms. So around the time he was living in Paris, when he was in his mid-30s, he started, or he starts to note the fact that he's experiencing what we would recognise as seizures. So he went through moments where his one hand would spasm or contract in a strange way. He would lose awareness and he would sort of stare off into space in an unusual way. And then afterwards he would be kind of confused and not really remember what had happened. And this is a pretty, as I understand it, a pretty normal description of a temporal seizure. So early on he was having seizures like that, and then it was when he left Paris that things started to get a little bit more alarming. He described himself as having attacks where he'd become very frightened and sometimes lose awareness, and he also had strange gastric sensations. And in a letter, his brother noted that his personality seemed to have changed as well. So he was sometimes gentle and caring, like he'd always been before, which you can see in his letters. He's a very kind of caring person. And sometimes he was still like that, and then sometimes he was intolerable. He started arguments a lot. Didn't take care of his appearance as much. And apparently the two sides of his personality were fairly well differentiated. So he'd be very nice for a while, and then he'd flick to being quite unpleasant. And this was also when his paintings started to change. So whereas before the colour palette he'd used had been fairly realistic, if anything more earthy and muted than realistic, he started to produce paintings with extremely bright colours with a lot of yellow. And Van Gogh himself actually remarked that he noticed his palette had become brighter. He drank and smoked a lot at this point, including the herbal spirit absinthe. A lot of ink has been spilled about absinthe and its effects. So it's, to explain what it is, it's a green, very alcoholic spirit. I don't think it counts as a liqueur, but it's kind of a herbal spirit. And when you drink it, I think you're supposed to do a ritual where you put a perforated spoon over the glass and put a sugar cube on the spoon and then pour boiling water over the sugar cube to take the edge off the alcohol. But it has this reputation of being psychoactive or having psychoactive properties, and it had the reputation at the time as well, of being the kind of thing artists drank and then they got weird psychoactive effects and they went mad. And more recent research has strongly suggested that absinthe, while it does contain chemicals which can be psychoactive and which can produce convulsive effects, at least modern absinthe doesn't contain them in quantities anywhere near high enough to produce those effects in people. Like you'd have to alcohol poison yourself several times over before it had a psychoactive effect beyond the normal psychoactive effects of alcohol. Nevertheless, it's not completely clear if maybe absinthe at the time had a much higher concentration of this chemical, or maybe there's some other chemical that's less well studied that produced these effects, or perhaps absinthe at the time may have been cut with something that it wasn't supposed to be cut with, like methanol or something like that. So it's as far as I can make out from the literature, it's still slightly up in the air whether late 19th century absinthe had that kind of effect. This researcher suggests probably not, but it certainly doesn't seem to be a consensus as far as I can tell. It's still banned in some parts of the world. I think it's banned in the US for purchase, although it's common in some European countries, and legal in the UK, although it's certainly not very common to drink it as far as I've seen. I've had it once and found it quite unpleasant tasting. A little while before he left Paris, he said that he stopped drinking and smoking quite as much, and the result was a lot of despair and fatigue, and he said he was surprised he didn't have a stroke. So he moved from Paris to Arles in the south of France, and he started drinking again. He was a lot more emotional than he'd been in the past, and he tried to throw himself into his work to distract himself from it, and sometimes relied on drinking if it was getting too much. Over this period, he experienced physical symptoms like bad circulation, causing him to feel lightheaded and a weak stomach. And he found he got sexually aroused a lot less. The heightened emotional states became more intense in both directions, so sometimes he had attacks of extreme anxiety, sometimes he felt very listless and tired, sometimes he felt intensely sad, and sometimes he was, as he says in an English translation, twisted by enthusiasm or madness or prophecy. And sometimes he was violently angry. This seems to have come on very quickly, and the sheer range of symptoms has caused all sorts of people to propose all sorts of diagnoses. But what happens next is, it's ended up being maybe the most famous part of his life, and seems to have led to him being given more serious medical attention at the time. In autumn 1888, Van Gogh and another artist called Paul Gauguin moved into a house in Arles called the Yellow House together. And over the course of the 2 months that Gauguin was staying there, it seems as if their relationship became increasingly strained, and there were a few occasions where Van Gogh seemed to behave in a threatening way towards Gauguin, and a lot of this is from Gauguin's memoirs, which were written quite a long time afterwards. So, it's sort of his word, but it does make sense in line with what happened next. So, it seemed to come to a head around the time that Gauguin had been thinking of leaving Arles, and at one point Van Gogh asked him if he intended to leave, and Gauguin responded that he did intend to leave. And then towards the end of December, there was an incident where Gauguin went out for a walk, and Van Gogh followed him and ran towards him with an open razor. And then when Gauguin looked at Van Gogh seemed to sort of bow his head and then go back home. So it was probably either this specific incident or incidents like it that caused Gauguin at some point to go and stay in a hotel. And he was staying in a hotel on the night of the 23rd of December, the night before Christmas Eve, when Van Gogh, for reasons that are still unclear, cut his left ear off with the razor, and then wrapped the stump of the ear in paper, and then took the detached ear to a brothel where he gave it to a 17-year-old girl who was employed to clean the brothel, although newspapers at the time reported that it was a prostitute he'd given it to. He then went back home, and obviously the police were told one way or another, and then the next morning the police found Van Gogh at his house, unconscious, having sustained quite a lot of blood loss, obviously, from cutting his ear off. And he didn't remember cutting his ear off. Gauguin mentions that when he returned to the yellow house, the whole of Arles was waiting there outside, kind of presumably having heard about what had happened. And then it was at this point that Van Gogh was hospitalised on Christmas Eve, 1888. And it was in hospital that he received a diagnosis. One diagnosis was, what was it? Acute mania with generalised delirium, and he was also diagnosed with epilepsy, and this was a specific kind of epilepsy that was described medically at the time as larvate epilepsy. And it was there were a number of doctors who were associated with this case, but Félix Rey is the most famous, who he did a portrait of, and it seems to have been Rey's opinion that he had epilepsy. While he was in hospital, the doctors wrote to the mayor of Arles, seemingly with the intention of sending Van Gogh to an asylum. But over the course of a couple of weeks, it was steadily realised that he would probably recover enough not to have to go to an asylum. There are various descriptions of what his behaviour was like while he was at the asylum. He was certainly not behaving normally. Gauguin, in his memoir, which as I say was written years later, said that he did things like try to sleep with other patients, chase the nurses around. I think he said he bathed in a coal tin or a coal pan or something like that. Theo Van Gogh, who was his brother, went to visit him and said that there was a moment, there were a few minutes of lucidity where he was able to have an actual conversation with him, but then he descended again into talking about theology and philosophy. And the way it's worded in Theo's letter suggests that this talking about theology and philosophy wasn't just Van Gogh talking about something he was interested in, but was, to Theo, as an indication that he was going back into his psychotic state or whatever it was. So this is maybe a suggestion that part of what characterised this state he was in was that he would sort of ramble about theology and philosophy and things like that. And he was prescribed potassium bromide, which is an anticonvulsant, which was widely used to treat epilepsy at the time. Nowadays not used to treat human epilepsy so much, although it is still used against epilepsy in dogs, because I think it has some strange side effects in humans. But he was given potassium bromide, seemed to recover very impressively, which he himself thought was a result of the potassium bromide. And then he was allowed to go home without being admitted to an asylum. So he wrote to his siblings explaining he was feeling very well again, apart from a general undercurrent of calm sadness that he couldn't exactly describe. Although during this period he says he had 3 fainting fits during which he wasn't aware and he couldn't remember what happened afterwards. These might have been temporal seizures, but he doesn't really describe them in enough detail. So the glaring question that many researchers have asked is, could all this stuff just be explained by epilepsy? Or epilepsy exacerbated by something obvious he was doing, like drinking too much? Epilepsy is a group of conditions which are characterised by seizures, which are periods of electrical activity in the brain, overactive electrical activity, which is unusually synchronised. When the seizure happens and how it plays out in the brain obviously directly affect what it will cause the person to experience. So sometimes people will shake and experience uncontrollable muscle contractions all over their body. Sometimes they'll just lose awareness and stare into space for a few minutes because the random electrical activity isn't organised enough to produce any sensory experiences. Van Gogh experienced some things that certainly sound like seizures, but could a full-on psychotic breakdown be caused by epilepsy? Many modern researchers have commented that Van Gogh's breakdown where he cut his ear off sounds a lot like psychosis. The NHS website lists the 3 main categories of psychosis symptoms as hallucinations, which are sensory experiences that aren't connected to real things, so seeing or hearing things that other people can't see or hear; delusions, which are beliefs that are very out of line with what everyone else believes; and disordered thinking and speech. Van Gogh mentions hallucinations in some of his letters. A few weeks after his hospitalization, he wrote, "The unbearable hallucinations have stopped for now, reducing themselves to a simple nightmare on account of taking potassium bromide, I think." Delusions are also evidenced in his letters. So can epilepsy cause psychosis? A 2014 review found that 7% of people studied with temporal lobe epilepsy experienced some kind of psychotic illness, and a 2017 study went into some specifics based on case studies. Apparently episodes of psychosis can follow a seizure and last sometimes a couple of weeks, or very occasionally longer, and are characterised by things like delusions that the person is being persecuted or harmed by someone, and aggressive and violent behaviour. Van Gogh certainly showed aggressive and violent behaviour, if Gauguin is to be believed. So at this stage, it certainly seems possible that Van Gogh's epilepsy explained most of his issues. Both excessive alcohol consumption and alcohol withdrawal can make epilepsy worse, so being an alcoholic certainly wouldn't have helped. So the question becomes, are there other things it could have been which would have fit the symptom set better? Some people have suggested Meniere's disease, which wasn't known about at the time, and this is a very unpleasant disease of the inner ear that can cause dizziness, tinnitus, so hearing ringing sounds, and losing balance. A researcher called C. Martin, I couldn't find this person's first name, addressed the theory of Meniere's disease in 2011. I wasn't able to access the original 1990 paper because JAMA's website is difficult to work with. But yeah, so I don't know if they make further claims than this, but it seems like the idea was based on a few vague comments in Van Gogh's letters that could just be interpreted as balance-related or ear-related if you read them the right way. But Martin concludes that there's really nothing in Van Gogh's letters that points to Meniere's disease in particular. As far as I know, there's no clear link between Meniere's and psychosis either, although I understand it's a very unpleasant disease in its own way, and yeah, basically in this case, it seems like there's no real reason to think it was Meniere's, according to Martin at least. Martin and also Bloomer in 2002 agree that it's clear beyond any reasonable doubt that Van Gogh's illness was caused by temporal lobe epilepsy. Martin says psychomotor partial temporal lobe epilepsy, which, save for a few slight terminological differences between now and the 1800s, was pretty much exactly what Felix Ray diagnosed him with while he was in hospital. The temporal lobes are at the sides of the brain where the ears are, and they're associated with all kinds of things, including processing your hearing, understanding language, long-term memory and memory formation, and also visual object recognition, so recognising the things you're looking at. Having temporal lobe epilepsy doesn't necessarily mean that all these things would be disrupted. Exact manifestations differ from person to person. After Van Gogh left the hospital in early 1889, he had 2 more psychotic episodes, and in May that year he voluntarily went into an asylum in Saint-Rémy. He was there for an entire year, painting a lot while he was there and experiencing occasional relapses of illness. In letters to Theo, or Theo, I keep mispronouncing his name, one of his doctors commented that he still thought it was epilepsy. Martin recounts some of the things Van Gogh describes in his letters from Saint-Rémy. Van Gogh said, "Speaking of my condition, I'm still so grateful for yet another thing. I observe in others that, like me, they too have heard sounds and strange voices during their crises, and things also appeared to change before their eyes. And that softens the horror that I retained at first of the crisis I had, and which, when it comes to you unexpectedly, cannot but frighten you beyond measure. Once one knows that it's part of the illness, one takes it like other things." People get used to things very quickly, and I think Van Gogh is saying pretty clearly here that the hallucinations he had were really alarming at first, and were therefore very significant deviations from his normal sensory experiences. And this is understandable. I don't know the nature of his hallucinations beyond what he says in his letters, but hallucinations feel as if they're genuinely coming from your senses. It's very different from imagining that you're seeing something or imagining you're hearing something. For somebody experiencing this without expecting it or knowing what it is, you can imagine how startling it might be. He acknowledges that these episodes at Saint-Rémy had some religious content, which is something that Theo referenced while he was still in Arles. I'm just going to say Theo now. Over the course of his hospitalization at Saint-Rémy, he did various self-destructive things while in an apparently confused state, like drinking turpentine and paint. In May 1890, he was discharged from Saint-Rémy, and the doctor who had been overseeing him said he was cured. He moved to an inn in a village near Paris called Auvers, where Paul Gachet, a doctor who was known for associating with artists, lived. Over the 2.5 months that he lived there, he seemed to be clear of a lot of symptoms and produced a lot of paintings. His brother's health was deteriorating, Theo's health was deteriorating, who, bear in mind, was still financially supporting him from a distance. As the weeks went on, Van Gogh's letters started to take a gloomier tone. He described his life as threatened at its very root, possibly a reference to the fact that if he didn't receive financial help from Theo, if Theo died or something, he would be in a real nasty situation. An account by the daughter of the innkeeper whose inn he was staying at said that he left the inn to paint one morning in July and then didn't come back at nightfall, like he usually would. He showed up after dark, clutching his stomach, and walked upstairs, briefly interacting with the girl's mother, who asked if there was a problem. The father, the innkeeper, went upstairs, and Van Gogh showed him a bullet wound in his stomach. He said to some people who came to visit, "Don't accuse anybody, I wanted to commit suicide." A telegram was sent to Theo Van Gogh, who appeared as soon as he could, and sat with Vincent, who deteriorated. A few times he mentioned that he wanted to die like this, and after a few hours he did die at about 1:30 in the morning, at the age of 37. C. Martin, who's very much of the opinion that Van Gogh's problems were mostly caused by epilepsy, addressed comments that his symptoms were unusual. His episodes lasted for a very long time. I might be misinterpreting Martin's words here because I'm not an expert, but it seems like they suggest Van Gogh suffered multiple seizures linked together by post-critical states of confusion. They also point out that Van Gogh exhibited a very wide range of symptoms and suggested that he may just have been unlucky enough to have epilepsy originating in the parietal-occipital crossroads in the brain, meaning that seizures could have propagated in all sorts of different directions and affected different parts of the brain. By a long way, Meniere's disease isn't the only thing that's been suggested other than epilepsy. Bipolar disorder is another significant suggestion people have made. This causes sufferers to experience alternating periods of depression and fatigue, and mania and extreme enthusiasm, almost to a self-destructive level sometimes. And it can also cause memory problems and psychosis. Bloomer argues that Van Gogh's mood changes were extremely rapid compared to the mood changes that are sustained over weeks or months, more often seen in bipolar disorder. If someone with bipolar disorder experiences 4 dramatic mood changes in a month, it's characterised as ultra-rapid cycling. That frequency of mood change, or even much faster, seems to have been common in Van Gogh's last couple of years, and it sounds like that would put him as a fairly serious outlier for normal bipolar symptoms, although of course somebody who knows more about it than me may well dispel that in the comments if I'm wrong. One interesting possibility is that Van Gogh had lead poisoning from ingesting his own leaded paint. That would cause gastrointestinal symptoms, which he complained of, memory problems, which he had, although these seem to have been concentrated around attacks, and depression, which he certainly experienced. It can also cause things like tingling sensations and ataxia, a condition that causes poor balance and difficulty coordinating actions, and sometimes speaking and swallowing, which I'm not aware of him complaining of in general. Bloomer addresses the possibility that he had schizophrenia, which one of Van Gogh's sisters was actually diagnosed with. Schizophrenia often occurs in episodes where symptoms flare up, with intermittent periods with few or no symptoms, and the symptoms can be what are called positive symptoms, psychotic symptoms, which are sort of hallucinations, especially hearing voices, delusions and disorganised thinking. But people also experience symptoms like withdrawing from their social life or neglecting their appearance and hygiene. The psychotic symptoms can understandably be accompanied by very drastic emotional changes. Bloomer says that the fundamental symptoms of schizophrenia are absent for Van Gogh, and that his symptoms were episodic, whereas schizophrenic symptoms are chronic. This confused me when I read it, because it sounds like psychosis in schizophrenic patients can last for only a few days or weeks, in line with Van Gogh's episodes, but maybe someone who knows more about it can help there. He also seems to imply that the amnesia and confusion associated with Van Gogh's episodes are more likely to be epilepsy-related than schizophrenia-related. Finally, some people have suggested that he had syphilis, which is a sexually transmitted disease that can eventually cause seizures, memory problems and personality changes if it's left untreated for years. This is bolstered by the fact that he had gonorrhea in the early 1880s, another sexually transmitted illness, and his lifestyle at that point certainly put him at risk of those illnesses. Bloomer argues that there are specific physical symptoms of syphilis that are never mentioned in Van Gogh's letters or medical records, and severe neurological complications usually take years and years to manifest. Van Gogh seems to have been most sexually active only a few years before he died, not leaving much time for the neurological symptoms to get that bad. On that basis, Bloomer and Martin both conclude that temporal lobe epilepsy is the most straightforward diagnosis that requires the least leaping to conclusions. An aside is that some have suggested Van Gogh developed some kind of visual disorder that made things appear more yellow-tinted than normal. Xanthopsia causes transparent components of the eye to become yellow-tinted, which filters any light that hits the retina with a yellow bias, and that can be caused by consuming medications derived from foxgloves, which is a poisonous European plant. The purple one with the sort of bell-shaped flowers if you live in Europe. Maybe they live elsewhere, I'm not sure. This has sometimes been taken as an explanation for Van Gogh's yellow bias in his paintings towards the end of his life, but there's no evidence Van Gogh ever took this medication, and I don't think it's even an epilepsy medication. Something else I would add is that having a yellow bias in your vision wouldn't necessarily make your paintings yellower. After all, when you're looking at the paints on your palette, they're going to appear yellow-tinted as well. So if a tree looks yellow-tinted green to you and your green paint also looks yellow-tinted green, you'll still use the green paint to paint the tree, resulting in a painting that looks basically normal to someone with normal colour vision. Or if the xanthopsia was so severe that you were struggling to distinguish certain colours from each other, you'd be making random errors in colour selection, rather than having a bias towards yellow in your paintings. I think the story of Van Gogh and all the people posthumously diagnosing him with things is a good example of a lot of excitement around one person, maybe sucking every possible interpretation from the data we have. Epilepsy was diagnosed at the time, and the idea that it was epilepsy has remained pretty robust ever since. Van Gogh himself seemed to agree with the diagnosis of epilepsy, and this must have been predicated on more than just what we see. We have a huge amount of information about Van Gogh's perspective, but we only have a fraction of what existed in the real world at the time. He may have met other people with epileptic psychosis at these institutions. He may have found his experiences resonated with theirs in ways that don't come across to the majority of us who don't have that illness. Or he may have just been passively agreeing with the doctor's diagnosis because the medication seemed to be working. We'll never necessarily know unless I've missed something in the letters. I think an important thing to bear in mind is that sometimes we have a sense that because somebody is historically important or outstanding in a creative field, their life must be very complicated. Plenty of people have medical diagnoses much more complicated than Van Gogh's probably was, and they experience complex symptoms that they don't fully understand, and maybe they have some creative outlet which they're just as accomplished at as Van Gogh was at painting. The complexity that existed in Van Gogh's life exists in everybody's life, although I do accept that these historical forensics cases are very interesting to get into. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll talk to you again soon.